tell me, so far, what have been your aha moments? And what have you taken? Like, what do you want to look into next? We'll start with Danielle.
I think for us, we're always interested at Rent the Runway or a recent topic is data cataloging. So we have a lot of different data sources and we have documentation a little bit all over the place at times, which I think is common at companies, especially as you add additional data sources. So I think we're, facing one of those challenges now, and that's something we'll definitely keep looking into. And it's great to hear like other people's thoughts on that.
Hey, Ben, how about you next? You have an interesting viewpoint, I think, because you consult with a lot of different companies. You have your own day job and that sort of thing. So there's lots of viewpoints, and also your explorations on social and your work there. What are you seeing that's next?
I mean, I think for me, the big thing is trying to figure out how to better kind of like, I don't know if the word commoditize is correct, but for small companies, trying to figure out how to implement things like ML really easily and business logic really easily, whether that's trying to implement things like DBT or other tooling, just because, I've been working with a lot of companies that surprisingly, although they're probably only in the 7 or 8 figure range, have a lot of problems that involve places where even things like ML could help solve. And it's just about trying to create like workflows that fit into the rest of their whole processes that match it. So I think that's been the big thing that I've been paying a lot of attention to. So like looking into a lot of ML ops and how to kind of transfer that in.
Awesome. Let's finish with Scott.
Cool. I think, what I'm really kind of excited about these days is like this. I feel like we're in this really cool moment where people are moving from these data stacks to support kind of business analytics kind of use cases and moving to more production use cases. And like, that's like the stuff that I'm always thinking about, which is like the tooling. I mean, a lot of the great tooling that was mentioned earlier today, the tooling, the practices, like how do we as like data orgs like step up to kind of support not just keeping dashboards reasonably up to date, but actually running production like processes. So like I think that like kind of like is the big thing I'm watching the next year and a half, and it's kind of impacting how like we're kind of operating our business over at Brooklyn Data. Ooh. And Boris is muted. We're gonna get there.
This is like really not my day. I'll just blame all the software. Scott, I think that's spot on. It's obviously all I think about.
I was trying to tee you up.
You're too kind. You're too kind. But why don't we actually dive into that and say, like, in the last year, would you say that in your day-to-day, like, has the scope of what the data engineering team has to do changed?
Cool. Who wants to take that one first? I mean, I can take a pitch, but I'm sure Danielle, you want to?
I can go. Yeah. So at Rent the Runway, our data engineering team, the scope has definitely changed within the last year. I think data engineering can mean a lot of things at a lot of different companies. For some, it's a lot of modeling. For others, it's pure infrastructure, and you might not be close to analysts or data scientists. I think for us in the last year, I kind of equate it to how startups like to control their own destiny. We kind of tried to do that on the data engineering team by leveling up our skills and supporting the general infrastructure overall, and not just the data ingestion itself, but also our AWS infrastructure and things, and bringing in tools like Terraform to manage that, so that any setup time that we have to bring on new vendors or new data sources, we can kind of manage ourselves and build frameworks to make it easier to do in the future. And that wasn't really something we were doing as much beforehand. And the learning curve for that is definitely a little bit steep in the beginning, but once you do it, you're able to like do things faster in the future. And so I think this past year, we laid a lot of foundational blocks that will help us speed up things in the future.
Okay, and so you're saying your data team didn't used to own the provisioning of core infrastructure. That was something you would have to ask a different team to do.
Yeah, we didn't always manage like our own servers and things. Sometimes we'd have some help from DevOps to set those up, or like one person on the team would kind of manage that. Whereas now it's much more like a team core competency, which is really nice.
I see. So you had to grow the team's ability to do this, but also make sure that this is within the scope of things you're allowed to make decisions on, right? Without
Yeah.
having to involve other teams. Okay.
Yeah.
Ben, is it similar like that for you?
I think the thing with me is like even between like whether it's my day job or consulting, I have people and clients at all different levels. Like for some people, like I'm just starting them at using data, right? Like they're companies that have like, again, they're like small companies where they're in that 7 to 8 figure range, but they've got 10 data sources that they're using and trying to aggregate all together, all that information. But then there are other companies that I've been working with a while. You know, we've kind of built their kind of core data infrastructure. Again, now they're trying to build some more like ML stuff and specific dashboards. And so figuring out how to productionize things like ML for them, I think is one aspect. You know, how do you take data from, you know, either data warehouse, data lake, and actually make it usable and accessible by applications. So I think that's like one aspect that's kind of changed, but it's more because of, I think, the maturity of certain of my clients in their whole data journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think part of that process.
When they're dealing with that, right? So I think of, you know, Danielle, you're kind of talking about the owning your destiny at the infrastructure level. And then Ben, I think of what you said is like, you know, where do you put the line on responsibilities to productionize? So
Yeah.
Has that been changing in terms of who is responsible for that kind of last mile?
I mean, from my perspective, since I'm often working with like consulting clients, I often do end to end. So for me, it's like from raw to last point. I think like in my day job, right? Like I think because I work at like a big tech company, it's pretty well isolated, right? Like data engineers are data engineers, ML engineers are ML engineers. I think the one thing that you often see changing is like trying to find like a happy medium in like performance, because oftentimes like some ML engineer might be using more of a batch processing method for their model, and it's slow. And then data engineers are like, what are you running on our systems? So I think that's sometimes a little more of an interesting aspect when you look at it more from like a day-to-day
Interesting
perspective. Yeah.
I thought we were going to have, you know, separated workloads in Snowflake, and so this would never be a problem. Turns out that's not true.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on what your company's running underneath. I don't think everyone's running Snowflake.
Right.
So yeah, I'm sure like as things progress, maybe. But
Sure.
I don't know. That makes me think of like when someone when I once migrated someone's solution to where it was like a bunch of just partitioned servers on one hard like piece of hardware, so a bunch of VMs, and like, oh, they won't touch each other, but we could literally watch all of the VMs like, oh, this one's working well and all these are slow. Oh, now these ones are fast and that one's slow. I don't know. I think they're all hitting each other somehow.
Danielle, does this happen at Rent the Runway as well? Is there, you know, unexpected
We
conflict?
Sometimes. I think we try and isolate it as much as possible, but you know, I think also when you have a lot of different data sources, there's sometimes unexpected dependencies on something else, or you want to deprecate one thing and then someone's like, oh, we use it over here, and
Right.
you kind of have to uncover that, especially in companies. You know, Rent the Runway is like 11 years old, so it's not super old, but it's not, you know, brand new. There's some legacy stuff hanging around.
When people are building various applications on that data, which I'm trying to understand, you know, where that fits in your world, right? Like the data engineering team has to, I imagine, support those things. Is there, how do you plan for different workloads that might happen based on different needs that you haven't predicted yet, like different applications that you weren't predicting on top of that data?
Yeah, so at Rent the Runway, we actually, besides the data engineering team, we have 5 data teams, each embedded in different areas of the business. So it'd be inventory analytics, consumer analytics, ops analytics, business intelligence, and then data products. And so whenever a team wants to use a new data source or build a new tool or platform or analysis, we try and get requirements up front to help gauge those decisions on, you know, especially data products where they might be building or things for the site. What are the resource constraints? What's the best way we can serve you? And really take it as a partnership. We don't expect to get it right from the beginning, but definitely having more infrastructure in place allows us to iterate and, you know, kind of meet their needs as we go along.
Got it. Well, given that you have 5 different clients of your team, right? How do you, what's the cadence that you manage to kind of make sure you're iterating?
Yeah, so I would say we have a data team meeting, like the larger data team, every other week, and that's just a good chance to see what teams are working on at a high level, and sometimes one team will do a deep dive, and then I think just regular communication throughout. So communicating, what projects are going to be upcoming, so it's not, oh, we're going to launch this tomorrow or things like that. And then, prioritization. That's hard at any company. I don't think anyone, would say it's easy, and there's always something you can't do that you want to do. But by trying to focus on things that will help the most people, that's one way. And also by investing in like core frameworks is another way. So maybe we spend a little bit more time up front, but that means the next time a similar request comes down the pipeline, we already have a framework in place, and it's much faster.
Right. Actually, how do you think about your stakeholders? Like, is it just those, do you think because you're in the data engineering, subgroup, that your stakeholders are just the data team, or do you think about the broader company as a stakeholder? We can expand this to Ben and Scott as well. But go ahead.
A little bit of both. So, our direct stakeholders are the data teams, but we're a stakeholder of engineering, and we, ingest data from them, and at the same time, we try and be a good partner back to them. And so I think, we, want to say, okay, we'll have this infrastructure in place, or this is what we'll agree to, and how we'll support you in return. So, on our day-to-day, we definitely interact with the data teams more, but, the data team stakeholders are also indirectly our stakeholders. So it's very much trying to serve the business overall, but just doing it in the context of data, I think.
I mean, in most of the places that we're working, the data engineering and analytics component are in a centralized team or kind of two centralized teams that are working together. And so what you see is like those two teams will work. I mean, there's two categories of stuff. There's just infra stuff that is just generic, and that is just that the whole kind of company is the client, is the stakeholder. Then there's kind of the components that you're working with the analysts to work with the stakeholders. So you have an engineer and an analyst working with stakeholders. And then, what I'm increasingly see is like actually external stakeholders. We're starting to do a lot of projects that, will bring in Snowflake data sharing and things like that, where you have kind of folks outside of the business that are consuming data. And that's like, that is a new type of stakeholder that I'm still figuring out how to manage the relationship with. Because there's kind of different SLAs, and there's kind of different types of kind of communication that we're still up on getting up the learning curve. But I think that, again, that's something we're going to see a lot more this year and next.
SLAs are an interesting topic, I imagine. Danielle, or actually Ben, both of you, how do the SLAs that you provide, if at all, kind of trickle up into the final kind of consumer of the data?
I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to specifically answer that question. I mean, typically, I think it's usually tied to some sort of, either for me on my angle, usually some sort of reporting that's done on a specific date anyways. So that's generally why they want that information by, maybe it's like 8 a.m. in the morning of Thursday, so that they can look at it and digest it by their meeting at 3 p.m. So I think that's one driving factor. I think a lot of the tables that and a lot of the infrastructure I currently support internally, generally it has some time, like there's some leeway, I think, with a lot of cases, since we're updating daily. I don't have too much information that needs to be like live. So I think that's one benefit currently that I'm lucky to have. Some people I know, they want that information like live every day, but I think it just also depends on the reporting that you're doing.
Yeah.
So.
Do you think of latency as something is a feature, or is that just an expectation, and whenever they're using your various data sources?
So I guess I'm curious what you mean, like in terms of like a feature, and like it just happens to be that way, or
right. So when you manage the prioritization of work, right, is it will deliver you a report and it'll meet the requirements, or is latency something you say, you want You want an 8-hour report? That's a new feature item. That's like a whole new kind of thing we're going to go build for you versus a daily, kind of latency report.
Sure. I think like I don't necessarily think of it as a new aspect, but sometimes I do, like, even with clients, I do the same thing where it's like I'll talk to them and figure out how often they want to look at something, just because it's like, yeah, it's like, do you need to implement streaming? Is that what you need, or do you can this just be loaded every day? And like just every day, because you're gonna look at it once a week anyways, so every day just gives us that ability to have that leeway. If something goes wrong on Thursday, that Friday it will load. So I think that is definitely something I'll talk to people about, because one, I think now it's becoming less true, but like in the past, streaming was a little more difficult to manage. I think we're getting to a point where that's less and less true. But so just setting up something like that would mean more overhead, especially for a small company. It doesn't make sense to do that. But also just it's like, you don't need it. Why?
Yeah. No, I mean that's a personal.
I find
overestimate.
We're at a point where just like almost all like latency problems can be solved by money, like just and
Yes.
like, which is like, I mean, again, sometimes we work with companies that are like, again, we want to have like an orchestration tool like Dagster, and like we want everything dependent, but like right now we need to react fast, so we just need Fivetran syncing every 5 minutes, and we need DBT running every 5 minutes. And again, like that is a solve. I mean, like, we and sometimes you just eat it for a couple months because, like, listen, the business needs to make these decisions fast, but then like this is not a great long-term solution because it's just really expensive.
So Scott, actually, that's a good question. So when you act, I feel like as a consultant and as a partner on whole data teams and companies, right, you tend to be able to frame things in terms of money versus time versus people versus complexity. Danielle, how do you help the business understand that there's dramatic differences in cost for various things like latency?
That's a good question. I think what we do is we try to understand the business context for whatever the ask is. So an example I think would be, we tend to have two different types of SLAs. We have some SLAs that are around metrics. So, how many shipments were sent out yesterday, how many people joined up on email, versus other SLAs that people check a report throughout the day, and we might need to invest a little bit more in those processes. An example would be, unlike most e-commerce companies, Rent the Runway actually operates their own warehouses, and so we have our own warehouses. Those teams are working throughout the day to ship orders out, and they very much need visibility in that process. Now, we never want our data warehouse to be a dependency of a warehouse like physically operating. You don't want to like introduce too much back and forth, and there should definitely be production systems, but at the same time, data warehouses frequently end up where there's lots of aggregations that you can do and be helpful. And so if people come in and they're like, oh, we need this updated more frequently, I think our first question is like, why, in a nice way, just so we can make sure we're a good partner and we're not just updating things for the sake of updating things to feel good about ourselves. But like Scott said, a lot of times you can dedicate resources to things and make it better, whereas a couple of years ago would have been a much harder ask to do that.
And you can ask a stakeholder and say like, hey, pay $1,000 a month more to get it more frequent, and they'd be like,
that I think is the really interesting key, right? That Scott, you get to have that kind of fun, and I imagine Danielle, that's why I was asking, because I think you're right. Technologically, that's the great thing that's happened in the last couple of years. Right? We've transitioned from these are hard problems that you need to go assign resources to, like that. Now you can just turn a dollar crank and magic things will happen, which is really amazing. Like, let's not kid ourselves. But given the way your team is structured, I would imagine it's possible that stakeholders that ask for a report to be faster have no idea that what that means is that your CapEx, your budget just increased, and they don't care, they're not involved. So like, do you try to pass that on? Do you try to make them understand that even though this is doable, this is costly?
Yeah, I think, if there's a good business reason, we're never going to just say no. And a lot of times people will have those conversations, as managers of, okay, here's the trade-off. And also a lot of times it's not necessarily a cost concern, but like a people concern. If we go on and take on this new project, what does that mean we can't do for another data team or things like that? So it's always about trade-offs for us. And it's also about, if we are going to do it, let's invest in the right way. So like self-service reporting is a big push right now, Rent the Runway.
Sure.
And that will pay dividends in the future, but the upfront time is a lot to transition and roll out a new tool.
Yeah, I mean, are there, since you all have a lot of real world scars and you're familiar with how the tooling is changing, are there things you would do differently that from even a year or two ago, like that you would try to tell data engineering teams now to avoid, or just spend the money to do something differently just because it's so much more worth it from a scaling or self-service perspective?
I think for us, I think our investment in like generalized frameworks has really paid off, and I wish we had done it sooner. And so an example is a team member, Sean, built a framework where it's really easy to get API data, and we can send it to an S3 bucket, stream it into Snowflake. And before, whenever we'd integrate a third-party API, we'd always like start from scratch and be like, okay, like what are we going to do this time? And there's no need for that. Like we now have a process in place, we have a framework, we built our own Python package to import it all, and it's much easier. You can spin up a new API and have it in Snowflake within an hour. Whereas before we'd be like, oh, what fields do we want? And do we need this JSON field? And so I think things like that, they take time and they take someone away from like, hunting down a question that gets, thrown across in Slack about, oh, what does this column mean? Or things like that. But it definitely pays off. And so I think if you can make the time to invest in an infrastructure project, it's definitely worth it.
What was the trick to finally get that done, or was it just Sean on your team decided I think
it was just prioritizing it. I think we had one more request and we're like, okay, we can either handle this or we can redo everything, and kind of make it so that it's easier to maintain in the future. And everything's the same way. Whereas if someone had a question about, the Facebook API or the Google API, you'd be going through someone else's code and being like, oh, like I have no idea what this means, and starting from scratch. Whereas now it all follows the same framework and anyone can pick it up. It's easy to update, stay up to date on.
And when you say anyone, you mean anyone in the data engineering team, right?
Yeah. It's not like a custom thing based on, what someone was feeling one day.
Yeah. So do you think, you talk about one of the things you're working on now is really pushing self-service. I imagine that means self-service for the analysts sitting on top of your infra?
More their stakeholders, yeah. So
their stakeholders, okay.
Yeah, so they're rolling out Looker to their teams, and we're making sure that we can support them in that. And a big part of that is, making sure all our queries are optimized. And we run on Snowflake, and so we're lucky that sometimes you can't just spin up the warehouse and everything's fine, but that's going to cost a lot of money. And so
that's my question. So
yeah,
who prevents it? Yeah, who prevents it from just being an Excel warehouse all the time? Like, how do you manage that?
So we have multiple warehouses, and some are dedicated to specific teams or jobs, and it's one way to just kind of take a pulse check on how much money are we spending or burning, depending on your opinion.
Sure.
And and we check in and we say, okay, this warehouse is up, 20% month over month. Well, in some cases you might hire more people and then, you expect like more usage. And in other cases, you might see that a query has slowly been creeping up in time. And that's the time when you want to refactor. And it's hard to do because it's easy to say, okay, well, we'll tackle that later because, it works. But it works at the expense. And so as we do more and more things and invest more in infrastructure, we also have to go back and make sure that our underlying stuff isn't eating away. Because if you save, 10,000 Snowflake credits, that's money you can put somewhere else in your org.
Totally. So do you think that's an interesting, do you feel like tracking the cost of queries, et cetera, is something that all data engineering teams should own?
I think, yeah, if you're the one paying for it and it's coming out of your team's budget, yes, you want to do it. If you're just starting out and like you have a million things to do, is like the cost of your Snowflake query your number one priority? No. But at a certain point, when you have so many stakeholders and a business so large, your bills, whether it's Snowflake or AWS infrastructure, become non-trivial and something to look at.
Right. Got it. Ben, Scott, how have you seen people handle this? Yeah.
Ben, you want to take it?
Wait, I was gonna say which part are we talking about? The cost or
Yeah,
like what things have
let's
changed?
call it cost management. Let's go backwards. Yeah. So let's cost management. Like I like that at some level, Danielle saying, we have the ability to monitor all these various warehouses and how their costs are creeping up, and we can kind of try to come in and deal with it. Is that, how have you seen people deal with basically, let's call it cost management as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen similar things across companies, or at least if they've tried, some have done it more successfully, where it's like they're tracking everything from CPU to storage, as well as then tracking down to the granularity of like, well, whose pipeline is the heaviest currently, which table is the heaviest, who owns it. That way you can go and track those people down. So I think that's been the biggest thing, and then like also just having like automated systems that like track like, oh, we're kind of above quota suddenly, right? Like suddenly we're several terabytes or petabytes above what we're used to. Why? And trying to figure out that and track that down. So I think that's kind of been what I've seen be successful, because again, you've got those alerts that tell you when, and then you can just track the who. And then sometimes it's someone who didn't even,
I was gonna say, any tools and techniques to do that kind of monitoring for people that might not know?
In this case, it's all internal. So it's like, it's all internal. Yeah, but I'm sure there are some options as well externally that you can implement.
So you have alerts for quota, like exceeding certain amounts of storage usage or compute usage.
Yeah, just basically, I mean, like, and it's pretty rudimentary in the term that it's just basically looking to say like, has it gone above what's normal, right? Like, and I think that's pretty standard in terms of like, that's a great way of just checking. Because again, someone might just pull in more data than they realize, and then suddenly, you're 30% up what you're used to, and it's like, why are we 30% up more than we're used to? And then you can kind of drill into that. Or you're using, 30% more because someone decided to implement some sort of ML model, and they, for them, they don't think about what's running. They're just like, oh, it took 4 hours to run, or 10 hours to run, or 12 hours to run. I don't know. It ran. So.
Well, okay, yeah. So Danielle, we actually got a question for you from the audience, which I think it combines the thing we were just talking about around, kind of monitoring the infrastructure, but also what you said earlier around this kind of push towards self-service. So someone asked, they've seen a lot of failures, like major failures, when people move to self-service reporting. So does anyone know, actually, for you or for anyone really at the table here, what prevents those failures? Like, what are the way? How do you create a successful self-service, kind of reporting setup?
I think you have to have really good underlying data, and if you don't have that foundation, then it's just not going to work. And I think I've seen that, you have to, put that work in up front. It's not something like a shiny new tool will solve. You can have, all the resources at your disposal, but if you don't have a good underlying data model, then it doesn't matter if you have a nice drop down and you aggregate, the numbers will be off and then people will make the wrong decisions. And it's hard to earn back trust that's been eroded in bad data. So it's better to start, a little bit slower, roll things out model by model, and build up that trust than trying to do something quick and shiny. Even if everyone's like, oh, we want the reporting, like, it's okay if it's a little off, like, we want it now. It's not worth it.
I just add, like, back to the conversation about SLAs, you kind of have to have an SLA with the business, and that is quality and freshness, like Danielle's talking about, but it's also like, whether it's documented or how you communicate if there's a downtime, and just like kind of all that jazz. Like, I actually think it's almost silly, but it's worth writing down a stakeholder expectations, like a commitment to your kind of stakeholders, what you're going to supply, and then they have a duty back to kind of tell you, like, not blindly trust numbers, use their nose, do the sniff test. But I also think, like, you kind of have to accept failures too, because obviously it would be much more reliable if only the data team's doing it, but there's a reason, because that doesn't scale. And so, like, you just have to control the failures and make sure that the range of kind of the bad decisions or wrong decisions that can be made are tight. But honestly, it's kind of unavoidable at a certain point. It's the trade-off of self-service versus kind of control.
Yeah, my take on this, based on both what you said, it is you want to try to remove implicit failures and at least try to make them explicit. People can tolerate, I think, failures. What I think, Danielle, you kind of imply there, which is very real, is people say, yeah, it's fine, I can handle incorrect data, don't worry about it. And it's like, no, you say that, but then you're going to send that to someone who's going to send it, and then my whole world's going to explode, and some VP is going to get really angry, and da 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 da. And so I think that might be the really hard thing, is like, how do you take these things that are actually kind of subtle, like the model is potentially not fresh, that's somewhat easy, but how do you take things like, don't aggregate the data this way, or make sure to only use it this way, and it's currently broken for this one kind of logical concept, but I don't know how to communicate that out, right? Because the looker will still allow you to query data, right? So it's hard to kind of brown out in ways that are easy to communicate. So I think this is a hard problem. It's worth trying to solve as people become self-service.
So you can put the communication where people are consuming the data. It's just incredibly challenging. Like you kind of want like some sort of like thing warning in Looker exactly where people are consuming it.
Yeah. And if you do it too much, then it turns out like Windows updates, where it's like people just see it and then they just ignore it, right? But it's at least you're covered. You've done the right thing.
I've done my job.
Yeah, I think a lot of we tend to try to look for tools and magical ways to confirm that it is always perfectly correct. But I do think some amount of communicating in app, in experience, is probably goes a long way. If you can kind of surface, we are experiencing problems, like that alone might just be useful.
There was that great Airbnb article from like a week or two ago about like the SLAs and things like that. Like some of those, like they were like an hour ahead of time. Sometimes they were 10 hours behind, like in the kind of the illustration. It happens. I mean, like just like I always thought, like early in my career, like do I hide it? Like do I apologize? It's just you just got to communicate, because again, it's the real world. Things happen. There's so many things outside of your control.
Yeah. I think this is a good lesson. I feel like most people that have consulted in their life learn this lesson really well, and people inside companies take a long time to learn it, which is communicate like crazy. It's people will be much more forgiving, right? As long as they know what's going on. And maybe that's the trade-off again, because I think they ask for self-service because they don't want to rely on you, and they hate waiting. But at the same time, they would probably be okay if they knew exactly why things are taking the time that they do. So I just want to be cognizant of everybody, like we're technically at time, but we got another 15 minutes of like slack in this session. So if you want to stick around, we can keep going. There are more questions. Everyone's favorite. Everyone wants to know, I feel like every time you talk about data or engineering, this comes up. So this is for all of you. Is what is a landmine inside your company when you're working that went completely sideways, right? So something that actually surprised you rather than just a problem that you had to deal with. Everyone wants more stories. You should always have one in the back pocket anytime you're on a panel.
Whoa. Think about this one. I mean, I'll start like just a small one, and not even like a real war story, while everybody else can think of like a real good one. And I think like the things that have surprised us the most, and so we're consultancy, we come in and we help folks with their data strategies. Is like, like I always assume that there's kind of someone owning the kind of the upstream production data infrastructure that you can go to make changes. And I think it actually is surprising sometimes when you go into like you're like, there's no one there, like no one owns the system, or like you're having it like, because we're inherently downstream. And so like if something goes wrong upstream, like you need to interact with someone. And it's like one of the learnings that we found is like, whenever we're working on a project, every single upstream data source, we need a point of contact and an owner. And so like that, like we learned that the hard way when we just like had to search around, and there was in fact no owner for one of the upstream sources. So again, I don't think that's a great one, and hopefully Danielle and Ben have actually thought of a good one in the time I've given them.
Thank you, Scott. I'll give one actually from Casper, where I used to work for Scott, actually.
Hopefully this
Was
doesn't
it Scott's
involve
fault?
me.
Please tell me it was
Yeah, was it Scott's fault? I don't know.
Scott is the landmine.
Yeah. But basically, one time a promo code was sent out where you could get a pillow for free, or like you could, get a pillow for half off or something. But the promo code wasn't actually unique, so it just got, passed around on Retail Me Not or those kinds of sites, and suddenly everyone got a free pillow, which doesn't always work out well because there's no such thing as a free lunch or a free pillow. And so that promo code had to be canceled, and we had to contact those people that redeemed a free promo that probably shouldn't have gotten their free pillow. And I think in that case, the data team really becomes on the front lines in those scenarios where, okay, you have this data, it's really organized, unlike a production system. You can, pull in all the different attributes quickly and help solve it. And then you can track, oh, like what happened to these customers later, 5 months from now, did they come back, or, did they not get their free pillow and now they hate you? And so I feel like the data team sometimes gets those kind of open-ended questions where something, operationally in the business might have gone not according to plan. And then as the data team, you can monitor that over time and you become like a really helpful and integral partner.
That's a good one. Too many free pillows. By the way, I have heard stories like that. We because where we work, the kind of tooling that we provide people, which is to really deploy data into live production systems and into applications for marketing and sales. I have seen that exact kind of thing can happen because different discounts and discount codes can be applied from different people and different tools, and they're not correlated to each other. And then suddenly there are companies, including, let's call it one of the 5 largest tech companies on earth, I'll just say that, okay, where they would reach these situations where the data team had to come in and pull the data together to realize that there were companies paying that were negative margin, right? Like they were literally getting the servers for less than what they cost, which is a huge problem in terms of making a phone call to say, like, we're paying you right now to use our software. So yeah, that is real. Free pillow is not unique. That's a good one. Ben, you got a good one?
I'm trying to think I don't think it's as good as a free pillow, because I think that's a little more real and tangible. I think for me, the problems I've seen has happened not necessarily just to me, but like, just working in teams and coming in and getting to find these problems is like the constant assumption of like the source of truth being accurate. Like even amongst like between like your data system and the actual application. Like there was recently a case that I worked on where it was like, we were looking at the data warehouse and we were looking at like the source of truth application. It's like, okay, in theory, if I filter it this way on the application, I should get the same number on the other side. And it was like, wait, why is this? It's like close sometimes, it's different other times. Like, what is this? And it was like one of these weird cases where it's like the engineers on the software side had like updated the ML model on like the data side, but they hadn't updated on the application side. So it was like one of those things where it was like, how did this happen? Like you'd assume that you're just pulling this from the same place, so why is this different? And so like I think that's happened like both when I first started working, like I remember that happening like directly to me where I assumed like something was the source of truth, and it was like, oh, they told me this is like accurate, so I believe it, so I'll just pull it. And then like coming into a project where that was like the problem, it was like, oh, that's weird, and then having to like go talk to software about that.
I think I can generalize this, which is all of these problems is probably the ultimate landmine that is very hard to explain to people, because I don't even think it's really taught in the world of data, which is all of this is a distributed system, right? And like if you go to university to study distributed systems, which is almost like a subpart of like computer science, you understand that this is the issues of consistency. Like some of these are really like hard, problems that you just can't just hide them. And I see a lot of people who think like it should just match, right? It's like, well, match when? At some level, you're going to deal with the speed of light. Like at some point, like you're going to realize that even that cannot be instantaneous, right? Like there's actually no magic at some level. And so at a long enough period, right, for a long enough running system, skew has to happen somewhere, some point, like by definition. And it's kind of like the landmine that is always there, and it's just waiting for someone to learn it, and then how do you communicate that out? It's really, because it's hard to tell a business person. It's like, listen, it's a distributed system, so your idea that A and B were supposed to be the same at all points in time is wrong, like mathematically wrong. I mean, good luck with that, right? So I find like that's my.
You got to make sure to also like you don't turn into like this like at a certain point you've seen so many war stories in data that like you also have to make sure you don't like you can turn into this like jaded, horrible like like you have to have question like a successful data person has to question everything but not like still be an optimist. Like that,
which is a hard thing to do, right? Data engineering, you're in the bowels of this, you see all these problems all the time. I'll give you a little one that it was a really surprising landmine. We think about data being correct all the time, right? And we had a customer that had been using our product for ages, and they had a well-oiled system, and there were ways to correct for columns being wrong, and then you would just fix the column and everything gets resynced. But what you didn't predict is that their model would temporarily be incorrect in such a way that it went from having, let's say, 10 million users, 10 million rows, to something like 35 million rows. And that was a new failure mode of like, the data is not, it's wrong, but it's wrong in quantity, not in data set, like not in kind of attributes. And we had no anomaly detection for that, right? And so the system just said, well, I'm going to push 35 million records to a system in which you cannot roll back that event. And so that became like a huge pain, right? Now you've created data that never should have been there in a system that can't unwind data. So my biggest, dream as we build our business and our product over the next decade is to find a way to build rollback functionality everywhere on the internet. But that's my white whale.
Also anomaly detection in general, like I think is like
that too.
It's kind of like we do unit tests whenever we build data infrastructure, but like I think that's a great point that like you and all of us, you truly cannot predict all the ways things will explode, and so you truly need some sort of observability tooling. And I think that's one of the cool things. Like the next year or so, like this space is gonna just like the tools are gonna get so good, and it's just gonna be like one of those. It's like one of those things that nobody has now. I mean, they have a unit testing, but like you're in a year, you're going to be like, how did I live without it? You know?
Totally.
Like right now we're eyeballing stuff. Like there's the gap is like my unit tests, predefined unit test, and then like my human sniff test. And I think, what you're going to try to see is like predefined unit tests, anomaly detection, human sniff test. And like the human element is just going to get smaller and smaller. And hopefully I think the kind of the stress levels of data folks will probably we'll find something else to be stressed about, but not this anymore.
Sure. Yeah. Well, listen, I mean, going back to what we said at the beginning, right? Like the scope of the team is only going to grow given more and more demands on data, right? So yes, we're going to build better tooling, and the stress levels will just rise because the total pie is going to grow too, right? So hopefully we'll all get into data meditation next year.
I love it. That'll be next year's session.
Next year's section, data meditation. Great. Well, listen, Ben, Scott, Danielle, thank you so much for doing this panel. Hopefully the audience got some good tips and tricks out of all this, out of all of our combined experiences. But yeah, thanks for doing this today.